Um, okay, so what I wanted to say this morning, today, is that one thing we rarely do, and it's about time that we got to it because obviously, as you know, there's been a lot of development, uh, not developments, but a lot of development work in getting to where we are today. What we're looking at here is our 3D printed ground forces. And yes, the infantry isn't painted yet. Well, none of this stuff is actually painted. And you can see the supports that were put into the 3D object to get them to print in FDM as opposed to resin properly, which I have successfully done. And therefore, am printing 15 millimeter or ish, probably close to 13 uh, infantry and all other vehicles. Now, you might say, wow, those infantry are much larger than they should be for that tank. Well, it's a close approximation. And yes, there is a mortar team that I'm also successfully printing. And this is all important because what it means is I'm able to, through the 3D printing, create these forces for virtually nothing. It's just the cost of the filament and the time it takes to print something. So the result is cost saving, which is the number one priority of almost everything we're doing. Because the idea is that you can't go through life spending all money and time and treasure, etc., on this hobby. And as you can see here, uh, we've got plenty of stuff invested in creating those 3D hexagon hills. Now, I want to also mention, although I should say what we're looking at here in general is the typical game layout for a 172 scale battle, like Napoleonics or Civil War or American Revolution. And the trees, of course, are taller for the most part than the 1 inch tall hills. Okay, so be it. Uh, in obtaining, purchasing those trees from and they are not 3D printed. These ones are all purchased. These are the trees from Safari Wildlife, sometimes called or mostly known as tube. So a big plastic tube with these toys in them are the trees that we're using. But as you can see, they are taller than the hills. And does that bother us? Well, only insofar as it creates a time and space dilemma in that the trees should not really be that tall, but they are. Hence, we are attempting to print trees that are about 1/4 the height of the hills. I'm sorry, 1/4 inch greater than the height of the hills. So if the hills are 1 inch, we really shouldn't have trees taller than an inch and a half or inch and a quarter because it creates a visual discrepancy. But so be that as it may, these trees were plentiful. Hopefully, they still will be. And although expensive, in a sense, relatively speaking, um, we have been able over the couple of years to acquire so many of them that we've got, plenty. But so, what am I not happy about? Well, what I'm not happy about is a couple of things. Um, if you look at the infantry and the tank and so on, it's just a paper, blank, yellow colored paper map. And what's missing is that realism of the texture of fields, ground, texture, etc. And the way to mitigate that is prior to finishing off the map is to put down approximate graphic representation of fields, which you would do in a historical gaming sense. But in a science fiction, this could theoretically, this is supposed to be um, and forgive me, I need to make sure that it's recording properly. This is supposed to be a science fiction game. Well, are you going to see terrain like this in a sci-fi game? Uh, well, that depends. Is sci-fi off planet? Yeah, this is a foreign planet. Well, is it a foreign planet that looks like Earth? Meh, not so sure. And is it a foreign planet that looks like Earth and has, cultivated fields? Well, maybe, but, maybe not. So hypothetically, what you would do to represent this science fiction era is all those trees would be changed out with some other kind of vegetation. Maybe that's the answer. Just by changing the trees, we get to a look that's more science fiction. And for the ground texture, well, that's just a matter of putting the graphic in the map before it gets printed. But it's already printed. So now what do? Once your printing is completed, do you put the sheet back in the printer and then overlay print a whole, you know, texture type graphic look on top of it? I don't know. Because you kind of really don't want to do that because it has to be done at once so that the fields are not printed on top of the roads and the rivers. So you need to have that graphic of the texture, uh, borders of fields. And again, the same question, would you have fields in a science fiction planet? Well, okay, you could, but that, implies an already established culture, society, evolution that this foreign planet has somewhat similar things that we see on Earth. So uh, what's the other answer or the other option? Well, would you put it on a different color? Sure. Would you put it on white? Yeah. Would that color be a lime green? Yes, because that's what we have. And also, that's all that's available. This paper is a drafting type of paper, and it's tinted paper, 36 inches wide by a billion feet long for a Hewlett Packard T630 inkjet printer, right? That's what we got. Uh, would we have a 48 inch? Well, yeah, hugely more expensive. So 36 inches wide is what you're looking at. Hence the reason we have tables that are 4 by 3 feet. And that's what these are. You put two of these together and you got a 6 by 4 table, right? But as we are in the 4 by 3 universe for simplicity, speed, etc., and easy to reach, that's what we're looking at. So the other thing I wanted to say was look at the hexagons, right? What's wrong here? Where's the realism? Well, as we did experiment and still provide fabric, you could put the hills down and then put the fabric down on top of the hills and create the illusion of slopes. Okay, even though without the plastic sloping around each of those hills, it would be a floppy kind of fabric, laying there. So that wouldn't really be that great of a difference anyway. It would look better, but you couldn't put an object on that slope because it would, indent the fabric. And of course, this means I wouldn't be able to do this. Like we have done in the past, we would print this at a fabric supplier. Okay, so that's what it would be. But you can't, well, you would print the map on this fabric and then lay the fabric down. So what about the slopes? Why is the slopes even an issue? Well, because look at it, right? It gives that BattleTechy, ridiculous, unrealistic hill structure. It looks like everything looks like a cliff. There's no way around that. And BattleTech, the universe of BattleTech players and so on, they accept that. And also in the gaming aspect, what does that mean? Does that mean that every hex around the hill is a slope? Technically speaking, it should be, of course. Hills just don't exist like that, not even on alien planets. They're still going to be geomorphologically, a shaped rise in the ground. Could be gradual or could be steep, right? but it's still going to be something that doesn't just jet out of the ground unless it's that, a cliff like. Okay, so that's that for today. And so this is what I was saying. We don't normally do this because we don't normally have, and yes, that's one of my dogs right there. That's the big dog Xerxes. Um, and I'm waking him up, and he wishes that I would simply stop all this and get back to normal life, which is to pay attention to him and care for him and everything. He's in end of life management, but he's still spunky, but we're monitoring. All right, so what is all this about? We we put these models on the table because we're like, we never get the chance to do this. In other words, we never get to really do an hex command mechanized game. So hex command Nova is essentially hex command mechanized World War II in the future era with walking tanks. And in this case, we also have a normal ground treaded tank, 3D printed, not painted, not properly assembled. You can see it's leaning off of its half, which is, by the way, how it has to be printed. When you print these things, the turrets have to be printed separately on the plate, platen, and then the body of the vehicle. But the treads, which is why you're looking at here, the vehicle itself has to be split, and that's split in mesh mixer. So I take the STL, I take off the turret, or I separate the turret, I cut the body in half, and then in the printing process, all these STLs, the tread STL is placed on the plate upside down so that the wheels and the tread are properly printed from the half that you split it to the treads themselves. That's how it properly prints. And then you have to glue it together. So trying to print it as one piece, what happens is that the treads and the wheels become entangled in the filament that is required to create the model. But printing upside down gets rid of that problem. And yes, it introduces another issue, and that is when you print something upside down, that's a big area, relatively speaking, to put on the plate. And now you have to get that off of there. And how do I do that? Do I take the magnetic plate off and then just snap the item off? No, actually, I don't bother doing that because I don't like to handle those plates that are on the 3D printer. Because your hands have oils, and that's interfering potentially with the surface of the plate. So I use an X-Acto blade to slide underneath the model and pop it off. And that's not easy to do, especially when it's still warm. You have to wait till it's cool. Okay, fine. So then the model gets assembled and it gets glued. And for the turrets, and all such things, and even the mechs themselves that are cut also in half with legs printed upside down, so that the hip is touching the plate and the legs are flying up in the air, and that gets printed with supports on the filament printer. Then you use sticky tack. That's right, a little bead of sticky tack to put the hips together, the hip to the legs of the mech. And the same with the turret. The turrets, although everybody says, yeah, well, it has to have a round bottom on it to go into the round hole of the body. Well, we don't do that. Why? Because there is no round protrusion, circular column, thin, not very high, on the bottom of the turret. And do we print the turrets upside down? No, and that's why. We print the turrets upside right, but the thing is, the issue with filament printing is that the barrels don't get properly printed. That's why resin printing is superior, of course, in many ways, because tubular objects printed horizontally in resin are fine, but in filament, not so much, right? Actually, not at all. You have to be really careful. And you have to print at a much higher resolution, like 0.1 or 0.12, to get those round barrels to come out properly and extrude properly away from the body of the structure of the turret. And that's why this happens. And as a matter of fact, as you can see in this image, the missile launcher, I think it's an LRM 10 or 20 even, had some extruded filament stringing happening around. You can barely notice it. And the reason for that is because when I printed the turret, that LRM launcher is part of the model. It's not printed separately. So therefore, the filament printer has issues when it comes to those things. They're called overhangs, right? As you know. So that's all what we're talking about here. And those are the challenges that we have. And of course, as I said before, you can see the supports needed to support the infantry when they get printed. I used to try and put them on their back so the barrels would be straight up. Not so cool anymore. I figured this out. I'm printing them upright. The guns are like this, horizontal. Not a good thing. Hence the reason for those supports. And those supports are manually placed, and you have to snap them off with, well, a, you know, a tool. You can't just snap them off because you'll snap the little barrel. And that's again the problem here. You can only print in filaments so small. 15 millimeter, we've trying to get to 10 mil, it's impossible, right? Because of the gun protruding from the body of the figure. That's why. 15 millimeter is the minimum that we can get to have a pretty good looking model. And that's why we're looking at what we're seeing here. And yes, they're mounted on clear Lexan round bases. Now, they don't have to be round, but that's what we have in stock, and that's what we're using. We use those for the mechs as well. And of course, different thickness or different diameter. But anyway, so there we are. Trees, hills, slopes, figures, manual supports put in place, printing vehicles in halves on the plate, printing mech legs upside down so the hip is touching the plate. And by the way, the mechs have to be printed on their backs. Why? Because the barrels, like I said, have issues printing horizontally. You can't do it. You have to print the mech on its back so that the barrels of the weaponry that it's holding print vertically. That's the only way to do it. And how does that happen? Well, you don't need to print with supports in the slicer, but actually you end up having to. But by putting something on its back, it also means that you have to sink it below the plate such that it touches the plate properly. And therefore, it loses the detail of the back of the mech. And what's in the back of the mech? A jetpack? Maybe. Other things that are protruding from the back of it? Yes. And those have to be lost. It is a give and take situation when printing all this stuff. And so therefore, most of the mechs we have a flat back. There's no detail. And that's what we're talking about. So that's what this is all about. And in summary, also the issue with the paper maps, the fact that in this particular case, I didn't have any kind of super detail. So it's just, yellow, summer, whatever. And so to be fair, the reason the yellow exists is we were going to do desert warfare World War II. And so we kept the yellow paper because it saves the ink when printing green and other colors. Now, why wouldn't we use white? Well, because then it would be snow. So yellow is a step toward green meadows and the green battlefields. Could I use green paper? Yes, and I do have green paper. But the problem is with that is that when you use green paper, the blue of the rivers is tinted differently than as you see now, right? And do I want to print green on top of all this yellow? No, because that'll just sap all the ink. Because look at it, right? That's a lot of coverage. So you don't want to ever print with so much green. Could I give it a green tinge in the program I use for drawing the map? Yes, I actually do that sometimes. I put a green semi-transparent overlay on top of the graphic such that printing on yellow, the amount of ink required for green is reduced. And that's how we did in the past. But now we just accept the fact that we'll just print yellow, you know? maybe it's like I said, at some point when we do the textures, it'll come out different. But right now, it's a very board gamey thing, and it doesn't really look that great. There's not really any detail texture, but there is one thing on here that is a graphic, and that's the house. There's a couple of them you can see. They look like an odd shape because they're actually two buildings. Those are printed on the map. That's a graphic that we placed, and they are throwing their own little shadow. So there we are. Height of the trees and all the other stuff, and also the situation with the hexagon hills is very evident when you look at the bottom of the image and you see the ridge line. You see how it has to snake like that, like this, right? Because that's the way the hexagons come out, right? Because of our orientation. The length of the battlefield, that's points out. We never play the game points up, right? With the hexes. It's always points out, so flat to flat. And then, of course, you could play end to end and therefore, point to point. But the layout generally is always hexagons flat on top of each other. And therefore, what that does, even if it was point to point, doesn't matter. The hexagons come out looking like that. The straight ridge lines look like that, and that's silly. So what we could do to mitigate that is print a hexagon that goes into that little gap right there. And we do. But they're slopes, right? We printed slopes. Yes. We actually went to the effort of printing slopes. And if by putting those in there, that would take away that, indexing look to the hexagon hills. So maybe at some point in the future, we will return to printing those gaps and fill them in with a hex that doesn't give that look. And I know you're saying, well, what about the orientation where it's not a flat gap like you see there, but it's a pointed gap? And that's correct. So then we would need to print another kind of a gap filler, if you will, to go around the big hex, to go around that big hill that you're looking at right there. And take away some of that sawtooth, look to the edge of the hills. And that's the other way around this. And we probably will have to end up doing that. Anyway, so there we are. Thanks. And as usual, stay tuned. We'll see more stuff, and we'll get back into doing this hex command, mechanized hex command, Nova, infantry, artillery, self-propelled guns, and anti-tank guns, and everything that we love about World War II and the future era, which is hex command Nova.